Sorry.
Okay, cool. For too long, the people of Earth have lived under the yoke of the West's scientific obsession. We propose to free the minds and the souls of those around us and finally attain a life worth living. So first a little bit of framing, and then 2 points, one on science and one on art. So the mythos of an objective reality demands a totalizing focus. That is to say, that it precludes interest in all else. At the point where one reality exists, that is the only worthy project of humanity, to study and understand that reality further. It is the only thing that is worthy to attempt to access, and it is the thing that we must engage with above all else. So how does this manifest in science and art, which we say are the two most characteristic outputs of the human lifestyle? So first off with science, we tell you that when one truth exists, the human project becomes oriented towards accessing that truth. So when we frame it as something that is extra-human, that this truth is indeed objective, and it exists outside of human perception, it exists outside of that which we can understand necessarily as humans, we tell you that the barrier to accessing that truth becomes human perception itself. So the evolution of human thought then becomes the process of chipping away at the veil of our own perception, of necessarily creating a division within ourselves, of trying to overcome the very limitations that make us perceive the world in the way they do, which is necessarily non-objective, which is necessarily subjective, in that it is dependent upon the unique situation of the observer, dependent upon the person who is observing that truth and is trying to figure it out. So with this conflict in there, the evolution of humanity becomes a fundamental attempt to destroy that part of the self that is subjective, to attain a sort of objectivity that we would tell you is inobtainable. So what happens when this occurs? We tell you that since we can never attain this truth, we end up orienting our progress as societies along these axes of progress that are inattainable. So how does this play out? We tell you that the myth of progress is that all human society is and needs to be oriented along this axis of progress, this attempt to achieve perfect truth, and to embody that within our society, to create a perfect society, for instance, to create perfect science, to access these sorts of truth. All of these things oriented along that line. Cheryl, take close.
Right, so a lack of progress is a better world. We're talking about a world where you don't have medicine, where you don't have engineering, right? All the progressions of modern science who pursues these truths through the lens of an objective reality.
We are going to clash directly with that by saying that even a more comfortable life is not worth living at the point at which it requires the destruction of the very humanity that those implements are put in place to solve, right? Medicine doesn't matter at the point where you're destroying your own perception just so you can live a little bit longer to be the sort of machine that they're going to be advocating. Going back to our point, so what does this myth of progress do? And here's where we get into sort of some tangible impacts of this myth of progress and how it plays out through this myth of objective reality. We tell you that the primary force driving colonialism is this system by which we create others of our human peers through that they do not share our same striving towards this mythic sort of this idea of truth. How does this play out? We see that in the West we are uniquely oriented towards certain ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. That there is an observable truth in the universe, and that we can access that if we somehow try hard enough, work through science enough. Cultures that are not oriented in that same way, that don't have universities, that have not developed along those same lines to value the same sort of empiricism that we have in the West, that choose instead to follow traditional paths of religion or other cultures, are always then put on the wrong side of this process. They are not merely different at that point, they are inherently opposed to the very project of the Western state, the project of the Western Enlightenment. At that point, we tell you colonialism exists because it justifies the exploitation of these people insofar as they are not serving the machine of this progress. Because they are not contributing to the Enlightenment, we tell you it is fully justified in the mind of the West to then exploit their labor, to steal their labor, steal their bodies, bring them to the West, or leave them where they are, take away their resources, anything to further drive the system of the West, since that is the only thing we see as a legitimate way of creating value. At the point where value can only exist as a product of this sort of Enlightenment progress of pumping out more universities, pumping out more physics papers, building the best medicine in the biggest buildings, how can it be defensible at the point where it requires this of other people who do not buy that worldview and who do not consent into that process itself? Opening.
On the point of religion, the fact that religion requires you to buy into a specific objective truth that this is what the Bible says, how is your argument still valid?
So an objective reality is necessarily one that is empirical. It's one that we can observe and attempt to attain. We tell you that religion requires a different sort of proof. Religion requires you to engage with it at a level that, yes, this reality exists, but it is indeed not objective in the sense that it exists sort of as something we can access. It's something that we take on faith. We tell you that the process of faith and the process of attempting to find out this sort of scientific objective reality are different, and only one leads to the sort of colonialism we're discussing. So what we tell you happens here is that the process of producing this knowledge feeds into the sort of colonial dehumanization that otherizes everybody else in the world and turns them into the very labor that drives that process. Furthermore, we tell you that this scientific mindset also just devalues humanity as a whole. And I talked about this a little bit before, but basically science becomes the new religion of the Enlightenment. We all take as granted this sort of fundamental assumption, without examination, that there is a truth, that we ought to strive for it, and that anything done in that process is valid. So when we get in PLI about medicine, the fundamental assumption is unexamined, that we ought to be striving for the things that lead to the most comfort, that lead to the longest life, whatever just prolongs our experience on Earth, and not instead analyzing what that experience ought to be, how humans ought to relate to one another, these sorts of experiences that we ought to be prioritizing and valuing. But we tell you that since this truth is objectively extra-human, objectively non-human, it's something that exists outside of our perception because our perception is always imperfect, always subjective, and it is always objective, always perfect, we tell you that we can never attain it. And that's where you get to the destruction of the self. Because you no longer care about your own humanity. You no longer care about the very thing that makes you human. You rather care about attaining something which we've told you you can never do. Moving on to art. We tell you that art itself, in the context of this sort of mythos of objective reality, demands representation of that reality. Why is this true? Same arguments under science. If there is an objective reality, and if art is a process by which we try to represent reality, thus art always has to try to represent something which we can never fully access. This manifests in a number of ways, but throughout history, art has moved towards the production of more and more verisimilitude. That is to say, that we attempt to be more like the camera, more like the computer, in perfectly replicating the world as it is, not necessarily as we see it. We tell you on one hand this just leads to boring art, because there's a stagnant point at which we will never attain the same sort of level of just merely reproducing something we could never objectively access. What do we prefer on our side of the house, and what sort of art do we create? We tell you that instead when you analyze the process of perception itself, when you analyze the experience of being human, that's when you get the very interesting art that comes out of movements that are in direct contradiction to the sort of realism that we saw in art history. We tell you this is more interesting because it reflects on our position as humans. It tells us something about ourselves instead of something that we can never attain. Again, creating this myth of something that we're advancing towards but will never fully meet. We tell you it's much more important as humans creating art and as humans engaging in science to engage in the things that tell you about yourself, that tell you why life is worth living itself, and not merely pursue the sort of hollow and empty life that they seek, even if it's a little bit longer. We're very proud of those.
As opposition, we fundamentally disagree with the government on what the mythos of truth serves, ultimately how it benefits humanity as a whole, and how it has positive effects in its entirety. We disagree on a few points, and I think I'll begin with rebuttal before going in precisely what we argue, which is that the mythos of objective reality is what pushes humans towards great things. And even if the mythos of reality is a mirage in the distance that we can perhaps never truly touch or access, it is the quest towards that mythos of truth that is ultimately enlightening and ultimately satisfying to the human condition. A few points on this. First of all, we disagree with their base assumption, which they seem to state with like absolute certainty and sort of like, this is clearly true that you have to chip away at the perspective of humanity. You have to chip away at your own perspective in order to access objective reality. We disagree with this because we think perspective is not a zero-sum game, right? Like perspective is something that can be expanded upon. In the same way that you can learn to see things in a new way, it does not necessitate that you limit the way you understand other things. We do not need to limit our emotions. We do not need to limit our understanding of one topic in order to understand another. We disagree with that, right? And we think, in fact, this ties directly into our positive matter, which is that pursuing this truth ultimately forces you to increase your perspective, understand more things, and improve humanity as a whole. We don't agree that this quest has to be totalizing. This is another thing that they sort of, like, basically assume. We think that it's done good overall, but we don't think that, like, humans have no other option, right? Like, they bring up art, and we think art's a good example of, like, humans trying to pursue objective reality through other means, right? Like, becoming a scientist is not the only means by which humans can sort of reach towards objective reality. And this gets into my other point of rebuttal, which is we don't think objective reality is solely like this empirical-based Western science, right? We think objective reality is simply the notion that there is an unquestionable reality that exists. And we think that, like, you know, my partner brought this up in the POI, and I think this is a good point, is that people who are religious are still seeking that objective reality. or you could call it a spiritual reality, right? But the difference is they are seeking it through religious methods instead of scientific or empirical methods. And we think this objective truth, the fact that this is still an objective reality, goes against their argumentation because these humans are able to pursue enlightenment, spiritual things on a non-sort of like solely empirical Western like medicine tiny idea, while still benefiting from that mythos of objective truth. And I think the art like sort of needs some more extension, so I'm going to assume it'll be talked about more, and then my partner will have a chance to respond to it. So then I'd like to get into our point of positive matter, which is sort of what I've said is like our guiding principle, and that it's that the mythos of objective truth is not important because it's something that we can obtain, but instead it is important because it is something that we can reach towards. We think the inherent progress of society, like throughout the millennia, is better than the world they pose where we sit around wondering like, what should we do, right? Because here's the thing. This is what humans have done, right? In many ways what they're talking about is the quest towards objective truth. Because they have lived their lives and they have tried to determine what is ultimately the best way to reach these things. Because objective reality exists. And by trying to reach it, even if they can't, they ultimately progress. And this is what humans have tried to do throughout the millennia, right? They've tried to say, how can we create governments which objectively, make a better life? How can we objectively understand the world better? And so forth.
How can we know objective reality exists if we can never access it through the subjectivity that you acknowledge?
Because my point is that it doesn't have to exist. The point is that the mythos itself is what we strive towards. And that is ultimately what results in the progress, right? So again, I think what's important is that this brings a goal towards things in society. It brings a goal in all aspects of things. And furthermore, like, beyond, we think we've explained like why this is true, right? Like, even, if you buy the argument that it's totalizing goal, like this is all that humans want to do, well, we've kind of explained like why we think that's a good thing, right? It pushes humans towards an enlightened path. But I think furthermore, you need to consider the alternative, right? Like, Henry sort of like really briefly talks about this when he says, like, humans should analyze our own perspective or like analyze how we should live life. But like, I mean, in reality, what will we be doing if we believe there is no objective reality? If we believe there is no truth for us to even pursue in the first place? We think when you live in that world, it is ultimately a worse one. We think it's a world where people don't attempt to push towards better things. They don't attempt to push towards this truth. And when he brings up subjectivity, I think that's important because it'll tie into our second point, which is how having the mythos of objective reality allows for self-reflection and the cathartic process that is. What would be the world without the mythos of objective reality? It would be one in which we solely accept that reality is determined by subjectivity, right? Like, this is true. I acknowledge this in your POI. Like, objective reality may be a mythos. Like, reality may solely be determined by our emotions, our perspectives, etc. But the point is that acknowledging this is important. Like, acknowledging there is reflecting yourself against this mythos of objective reality is important. Because otherwise, we never go through the cathartic process. We never go through the process of questioning ourselves because we say, it's all biased, right? It's all subjective. It's all irrelevant. But here's the thing. I've constantly used this analogy of like a mirage in the distance. And one thing that you can do over time, right, is you can compare things. Over time, we can look at things and say, even if we can never look at something and say this is objective reality, right? But what we argue on opposition that you can do that results to both of our arguments, like both like why humans need to go through this process of questioning themselves, this process of sort of expanding their ideals to potentially understand new things in their quest towards that objective truth, and why this is ultimately fulfilling, like, right? Both of these arguments, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Okay. So, one thing that these arguments both lead to is that even if you can never, in fact, reach the point, we can get closer to it. And what I mean by that is over time we can get better at saying, even though A, we can't say it's objective reality, we can over time say that A is more truthful than B. And we think that's what's resulted in progress and as well as questioning of your mind. What we've given you on opposition is the explanation of why the mythos of objective reality is good for human beings. We think that they're excessively selective in some of the assumptions they make on what the mythos creates, and instead we argue that it creates a push towards a quest, and that human beings having a quest towards something is greater than not having desire to push towards anything. And this is why we believe in the importance of the mythos of objective reality. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that opening opposition takes an interesting line here, where they say, oh, it's important to have the other because, that's something we strive for, but we're not going to contest whether or not, objective reality is real. I think it frames the debate in a nice way, and I'm happy to engage with talking about why it is that the notion of an objective reality, right? When we center ourselves as apart from this thing that all of us can never truly picture, but we can only simply experientially understand parts of it, like the blind man and the elephant, that we end up seeing, what are the harms of this method of processing versus a method where we say, there is no elephant, I simply feel the rope, or I feel like the tree trunk, and things like that, right? I think it's a useful metaphor because we're going to be talking about which set of people in the comparative are happier, which set of people can make better art, which set of people are more actualized, and I think a lot of that will end up flowing to our set of the house. Okay, so first, refutations to, this idea that, when we don't have an objective reality, we turn, we have this questionless life and we become a nihilist, right? First response is that, when we have these unattainable goals, when there's this objective other, that alienates us from the process just as much, I think that, insofar as we can never be truly perfect, right? And all we do is we continuously, move forward and, the only thing we prioritize on their side of the house is, we talk about, vaccines and things like that, right? What does that mean going forward, right? As we go to the future, it's going to, lead to, transhumanism, right? Where we, maybe we'll, replace body parts in order to achieve, a longer life, not this time, all these sorts of things, right? And fundamentally, at the end of that, we're simply robots, right? We fundamentally lose who we are as humans. And I think that, and the reason for that is because we continuously strive for this non-human ideal, right? We're never able to accept ourselves as, okay, yeah, our subjective lens is good enough. There must be always this other. There must be always this better version of me that I have to always strive for, not at this time. And so as a result, we see that, it really alienates people from the process and it ends up, dehumanizing them. Second response is that nihilism is compatible with human subjectivity, right? Because nihilism is about me, right? It's all about okay, how do I perceive things? Should I, continue to live? All that kind of stuff. It's not about, should I pursue the objective truth, right? So we think that, nihilism is compatible with ourselves. Okay. Okay, so that being said, I'll be primarily going into, I'll give three refutations to this idea that, the journey specifically matters. The first is that what went totally unresponded to, not at this time, is the colonial harms that Henry brings up, right? When we have a system where we continuously say, this is the science that we're going for, this is what we're going to move towards, and, we have science on our side, we have all this progress on our side, then anybody who doesn't fit that mold, anybody who deviates from that norm in any way, is criticized as being backwards, is criticized, as being, unable to come to terms with the real world, all these sorts of things, and they place a high value on that, right? Let's look at one very modern impact of how this works. When we look at China and global warming, right, we see that Western nations continuously, use these sorts of, accords to say, according to, our objective reality, climate change is going to happen, and so you guys should not be allowed to develop. You should not be allowed to use coal that we were able to use in the 1800s and things like that, right? I think it's a very clear impact of how, societies who are behind in some way, societies who didn't follow the progress, the myth of progress the same way that Western societies did, they fall behind, and they will be perpetually behind, and they will never be able to catch up because they will always be, evaluated through a lens that they never embraced, not this time. And extending that, we see that, so they mention you can pursue spiritual objective truths, right? The only real objective truth that we have in terms of religions is going to be, they're going to refer to the Abrahamic religions, which primarily are just a form of Neoplatonism, right? So when we look to Platonism, yes, there's the link to objective reality, but there are many religions that do not use Platonism as their starting point. You look at Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc. And so for these religions, many times there's no objective truth that you're pursuing. You're simply pursuing, your own subjective experience and trying to improve your own subjective experience, right? And you're trying to do this through aesthetic means, right? There are ways that you can evaluate on your own grounds, am I being a better human? Am I living up to the goals I set for myself, right? And so am I living up to the goals that I know are objectively true, that every single person observes this same set of goals and that we have to work towards that, right? And so as a result, we think then that, it is the case that those nations in particular and those ideologies are sidelined through these colonialistic harms, right? There's no real impacting as to why, we see no real response to this colonialism. The second thing is that that the lack of an objective reality allows us all to be in the role of God, right? I think that when you look through the Christian, the Abrahamic religion mindset, through this Neoplatonist mindset, you're aspiring to be God, but you will never be God, right? And so as a result, you're always, you're aspiring for this truth that you can never achieve, and it, leads to all these devaluing harms. What do we have on our side of the house? They say that we live like a nihilistic, I'll take you at the end, a nihilistic life where, you can't do anything, right? We say you get to be the God. We say whatever you aesthetically perceive is like, that's the goals that you should be maximizing. You should be doing what you want to do. On our side of the house, we advocate a radical freedom away from this objective reality, right? And we think that this has all the impacts that, Henry discussed. I'll take your question.
I'm sorry, in what way does a vaccine or you pursuing the cure to diseases make you akin to a god? It means that you're just simply wanting to get rid of all the diseases and ailments that would deprive someone of their humanity.
Yeah. So what is the ideal human, right? So we have these conceptions that, like you have to keep on like doing all this stuff. We should work towards, improving this total knowledge of the world that we have. And that's where all these vaccines and all this stuff comes from, right? But again, they don't consider like who are the people who are trampled in this process, right? Who are the black men who have to undergo like syphilis injections in order to make this progress happen, right? Like that's a well-documented case. Like I think it was like the Tuskegee infantry, where they had these black men, they injected them with syphilis shots in order to see whether or not these things worked, right? Fundamentally, their side of the house is always going to bite into these colonialistic harms. They haven't responded to them, and we think that that's a significant harm, right? Okay, and then the final thing we talked about was art, right? And I think they say Henry didn't flesh it out. I think Henry did plenty fine, right? He tells you how when we don't focus on recreating objective reality, when we indeed embrace the idea that there is no objective reality, I can make whatever art I want, I can do whatever I want, that we end up seeing more creative art, we end up seeing a better diversity of art, we end up seeing art that speaks to more people, right? And in our framework, none of this art even exists objectively. It only exists in the minds of the people who perceive it, right? And so we think then that when you create these new positive experiences, when you put the subjective at your pedestal or at your throne, then we think that you embrace a better life, a more creative life, and a more fulfilling life. Proud to propose.
Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about why people being able to choose some things that they don't believe affects just some societies in a more negative manner when those kinds of things have been shown to be false, right? We think in certain cases that this affects certain minority groups and generally the world as a whole negatively when people are given this complete freedom that the mythos of objective truth does not exist. But before going into that, let's just get into some rebuttal. First off, we told you that, look, you can never actually attain this objective truth, but the fact that you're making progress towards it is what matters, right? Because it gives you some sort of a direction in life. Now what they wanted to contend was that it alienates people because people know that since they're never going to reach this objective truth, there's no point in pursuing it. First of all, this is empirically false because we never knew that we would reach an objective truth, but we have nevertheless pursued it for the last 2,000 odd years, right? But more importantly, we think the fact that people know that they can get closer to this objective truth is enough motivation for them to be able to pursue it, right? Me being able to get closer to my target does give me some motivation to go towards it, even if I know that I can never reach it. People still develop machines to try and travel between stars, even though they know that it's a really, really long shot that they ever create one that's actually viable. And furthermore, we also contest that some people actually believe that they can reach subjective truth. For example, when Newton developed gravity, he thought that was the be-all and end-all of things. He thought that everything in the universe could be described through the things that he developed. And we think the fact that some people believe that an objective truth can be reached itself means that it gives them fulfillment in trying to pursue it. Now finally, let's get to this idea of what actually destroys your humanity, right? We think a fundamental aspect of humanity is being curious about the world around you. And being curious inherently means that you need to pursue an objective truth. Because if my curiosity leads to a certain result, and your curiosity leads to a different result, we think that then you are simply not satisfied with the answers you get in the real world, right? We think satisfaction comes from consistency, which is something humans value above all. That's why we spend so much time trying to find patterns in the world around us, because we love trying to find that one thing that is true for all of us, no matter where we are. And therefore we think this objective truth actually provides meaning. And we'd also contest that an objective truth through science is the most liberating way of discussing things, because science is the one field where an objective truth is allowed to have a different objective truth opposing it, right? You always have this entire process of debate and discussion for hundreds and 200 years in science, and even after that, the people don't realize that is an objective truth. They believe that it is some sort of truth, and they believe it's gotten us closer to the truth, but they always know that it can be contested and it can be challenged, which we think is the best way for people to continuously be happy, because when they know they can constantly improve their lives and improve things around them, that's when we're actually giving them ways to move forward, right? Then let's get to this entire idea of colonialism, right? Now first off we think that overall people have been generally improved by science, right? Now why do we think this is the case? First off, we think simply from a survival standpoint, having an objective truth that not being cold, when I'm living in a cave, helped the caveman create fire. Right? Things like that mean that an objective truth in general improves the way of life of that person. And therefore we overall think that a net, colonialism obviously was bad, but we think net benefit that has come to most people post that has been good in terms of them living longer lives, which allows them to analyze their own lives for a longer period of time, which again contributes to their happiness far more. Then let's get to this idea of art, right, which they wanted to bring up really briefly. So let's just, first off, what we'd like to tell you is that art can be a perception of objective reality. We think that in some cases, the paintings and the poems you write are what you think an objective reality should look like, right? And we think the fact that you still believe that objective truth does exist, you just bring it out in the form of your art. So people still believe that this objective truth exists and they try to express it in the form of their art. But we recognize that this is not necessarily true for all forms of art. We recognize that some forms of art might be subjective, but we still think we win on that ground. Why is that the case? Because we think things like medicine and living longer lives allow you to think far more about the art you're creating, and in turn creates more art. So if we're weighing it in terms of what does more harm than good, we think the fact that pursuing objective truth allows people who only want to pursue subjective truth to live longer and create these subjective truths and make them happier also means it's still a win for an objective truth, even though this does not happen in the majority of cases. I'll take opening.
If objective reality is infinitely far away, and I move towards it very quickly, do I ever get any closer?
The fact is, I told you in my 3 different arguments, one, people don't think that they are infinitely far away all the time, right? Some people do think that they're actually right next to it and they can discover it if they just put in a little more effort. And some people, we do posit that Elon Musk doesn't actually believe that he's going to establish a space colony on Mars in his lifetime, but he still pushes towards it, right? The fact is, even if it's something that is so unachievable that we cannot imagine it in our lifetime, we are willing to push towards it because we believe that it's an objective way of looking at the world that we live in. Let's get into my argument of why it is a bad thing that people can sometimes choose to not believe things even though it has been proven in a number of ways to be false. First off, we think it allows things like oppressive philosophies to exist, right? When people say black people are inherently inferior in the time of slavery, we think it allows people to believe that because they just see that as a belief that they have, right? On the other hand, when you have scientific studies showing that there is literally no difference between any member of the human species, we think people saying that we should not accept that would have been a terrible thing. I think the fact that you had these studies come up and tell people that all humans are actually just the same in terms of practically everything they do means that you no longer have this kind of an argument for a biological inferiority of races. And we also think that objectivity the lack of objectivity rather allows people to deny things like climate change, right? Denying climate change, we think, is a great harm that is something that creates tangible harms on the earth just because they're allowing people to have some sort of a subjective bubble which doesn't actually exist in scenarios where you've shown that there is a real tangible harm to other people. So insofar as we don't think you're allowed to hold your own subjective view, if it creates harm to these other people, we think we win on this point. And we also would finally posit to you that when you have this vision of an objective truth, and you also have like these internal subjective feelings, you actually have some competing philosophies, right? Because if you just had this subjective idea, you don't actually have anything to counteract it, and you don't have any direction to go in. But when you have an objective truth, we think that there is a way that you can go, and there is a way you can move forward with it, and most importantly, there's a way you can question yourself as to what actually leads to my happiness. How do I get to that objective truth? And for all these reasons, we think we make everyone much happier.
The two ideas that we get out of opening opposition are one, that curiosity is dependent on the idea of objectivity, and two, that science is solely an objective pursuit. We, on a closing government, contest both of these ideas. We will in rebuttal, and also our substantive material will analyze specifically how those things are non-unique, how those things still happen on our side of the house, and at the end of the day, the benefits of not pursuing an objective truth are far outweigh the harms of pursuing an objective truth far outweigh the benefits of said objective truth, right? So first, we get this idea that curiosity is dependent on the idea of objectivity. What we say is that actually what you do is limit the free thought. You're limiting the access to the market of ideas, right? So when you give the example of people like Newton, we say, look, that's great. Newton was a great scientist. But at the point where Newton was a wealthy white man in 1600, and he was the only one who had availability, only one who had access to the fruits of knowledge to be able to come up with these ideas, we think that we can access more ideas on our side of the house. We think that science is not about accessing specifically the truth, but about coming to a solution. There is no such thing as this pile of facts that we call science. Science is not getting something from a pile of facts and moving it into your bag, and as you go through life you get a bigger bag and you know more. We reject that idea. What we think science is a subjective pursuit of a solution. And on our side of the house, we don't think that solution is necessarily an objective reality. Right? Second, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but you're assuming that the individual who is searching for gravity is accepting what you are telling them is objective reality. If they reject your objective reality and keep trying to find their own, then you still have that same pursuit.
Right, and so, but the issue there is when you have to base your objective reality, and that objective reality has specific harms, we think that the harms outweigh the marginal amount of people that would not pursue their curiosity. But also, at the point where your only measure is that, look, some people will be happy because they'll satisfy their curiosities, we say the pursuit of objective reality creates a political tool that can be used for authoritative oppression. And that's where we're going to get into some substantive material here. We uniquely bring you, well, I just want to say flat out at the beginning, utilitarianism is just an awful idea, right? So, when we use utilitarianism to justify things like, oh, we should probably nuke Japan because we might lose a bunch of soldiers, we think that we're justifying war. We think that that's morally abhorrent. But moreover, when you allow yourself to do analysis on that, wait a second, what if there was a solution that didn't involve killing millions of soldiers and didn't involve dropping nuclear bombs on innocent people? We don't get that on their side of the house because they think that this objective truth is unique and that somehow without this we would be gone. We would have no ideas. We think on our side of the house that you're stifling the voices of people who bring unique ideas to the table. You're stifling the voices of people that have other opportunities to solve issues. But you disagree, Tanner.
Right, so under that model then, you would have a bunch of people continually trying to decide what is like subjectively the best idea possible, and you get no action. What was objectively decided at that time was this is the best way to minimize casualties, and ultimately it probably was.
Great, and that actually leads right into my second point, which is accountability towards our own bias, right? We acknowledge that there are solutions, there are decisions that need to be made, but what we would pose to you is what if instead of assigning those some objective value, we actually recognized our own bias? Maybe the Air Force has a stake in dropping bombs because they get more funding. Maybe that should be recognized instead of trying to justify it with some objective truth. We think that is a faulty assumption. We think on your side of the house, you have to fight those harms. On our side of the house, what we say is when we approach issues, understanding our own subjective, our own bias, then we can proceed. This is called basically attribution theory, right? Like if I do terrible in a round, it's because I'm having a bad day and I'm tired. But if you do terrible in a round, it's just because you inherently suck, right? There is no objective truth. That's a subjective interpretation. We think that on our side of the house, you bite that harm simply because you think that there is some objective truth. What we tell you is no, in fact, there is not. And even the recognition of said objective truth leads to issues, right? No thank you. So, at the end of the day, on accountability towards our own bias, what we find is that when you are able to make scientific progress without accepting an objective reality, you still get things like vaccines, you still get things like the cure for polio or whatever it is that Tanner and Camden are probably going to bring you, right? We think that it's okay to access those things, we think that it's okay to explore ideas, we think it's okay to be curious. We just would pose to you, maybe you should acknowledge your own bias, maybe you should acknowledge that people are subjective in nature, right? Second point, unique to back half. Political tool, no thanks. I just waved you down literally 3 seconds ago. Look, when you allow some type of objective reality to take course in your mind, to take course in your society, and as front half would have you say, would say is like it's social norming, right? But what we believe is that this leads to the use of political tools, the use of using authority as a measure to impose penalties to oppress other people. When we have things like kings, people who literally think that they are divine, people who literally try to convince other people that they are divine, and those people accept it. They accept it as objective truth. You bite those harms on your side of the house. On our side of the house, we would pose it, wait, maybe, just maybe, someone is not objectively better than you. Maybe, just maybe, because someone gets a B, they're not objectively dumber than you. We think that on our side of the house, we don't have all of these issues that you have to bite. Because look, when it comes down to it, and you have an authoritative figure, and you have someone who's making decisions using this calculus of, look, what if we nuke them here? What if we send in troops here? We think that those people who make those decisions and decide to use that objective reality are the people who are able to harm the most. We think when you're trying to solve poverty, when you're trying to solve systemic oppression, you're actually harming people by using a subjective or objective reality, because the subjectivity is that, look, people have different approaches to different issues. If you're trying to solve poverty in one way through one agency, that agency has an inherent bias towards how they can play a part in that, right? So if you're looking at the Department of Interior or whatever to solve an issue in the environment, right, they're going to tell you that they have a unique capability of solving that. The objective truth is that they can solve that because they have self-interest. And on our side of the house, we say that self-interest is subjective. We say that self-interest will still drive people, still make them willing to commit to these scientific progress. And at the end of the day, when we get all of the benefits that they're claiming is somehow unique to science, which is definitely not, we actually bite all those benefits. We bite none of the harms, but they have to bite a huge chunk of the apple of knowledge, as some would pose it. We are proud to propose.
Oh, no, it's all right. It's good, Dad. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it. Damn, did this debate get messy real quick, right? And I think the main reason for that is because a lot of the speakers on the top half have narrowed their perspective as to what this debate can actually be about when we're talking about objective reality. It's more than simply science versus mysticism, right? It's more than that, right? And I'm going to distinguish ourselves in this debate, and I'll probably take the round, because ultimately I'm going to expand the scope of what we're talking about to objective reality to include a couple more things, right? There is something such as ethical objectivity, which we think the world benefits from. And secondly, I'm going to talk about grounding and how that leads, like in objective reality, leads to better identity formation for individuals and ultimately a better pursuit of the self. right? But first of all, like some, I guess, housekeeping about what exactly happened. We get a couple main points from government side altogether. We get this idea that we're going to destroy the concept of humanity by pursuing to preserve humanity via scientific method. And we get this whole like slippery slope of transhumanism, how vaccines will eventually lead to us being bionic superhumans who have no semblance of humanity left. Well, this on face value is ridiculous, but if you follow that slippery slope all the way down, it means that one, we can at least eradicate polio. He was right, I was going to call him on that. But two, even if we become bionic superhumans, it doesn't mean that we're not human in and of itself. What it means is that we've rid ourselves of the diseases and the ailments that would deprive us of our humanity. Congenital disorders, musculoskeletal disorders, cancer, things like that. These are all things that deprive us of what it means to be human because they inflict on us pain and suffering that prevents us from pursuing human activities. If they want to ride the slippery slope all the way down, when we get to the very bottom of it is the eradication of human disease and suffering. That's what this transhumanism argument ultimately follows all the way down. But this next point that we get about ethical violations, right, is this idea that, like, first of all, we say that there are mechanisms in the purview of objective reality that solve for these ethical violations. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was solved because we eventually decided that humans are all equal based on genetics, right? That objective reality that when we compare the genomes of all different humans, we're able to decide that we're all equal, right? This is why objective reality is self-correcting, because there's certain standards that it must be upheld to, right? This is why James Watson, the guy who actually discovered DNA, was laughed out of the scientific community because he chose to pursue race-based genetics, right? Which is ultimately like not part of what is objectively true in this world, this mythos, right? So this is self-correcting system, and what Cannon points out in his POI ultimately solves the ethical violations. This next point that we get is bias, right? You can understand your own biases while still pursuing an objective reality. These two are not mutually exclusive, and they fail to prove that anywhere on their side of the house. Well, even if a bunch of different conceptions of objective truths happen, these are all competing with each other and act as checks on one another. That's how eventually we get closer to what is the objective truth. It's this pursuit that we're constantly aiming for, right? This is what makes it important, right? This is why ultimately I don't see anyone on government side winning this round. But let's talk a little bit about the mythos of objective reality in regards to what it actually means. We said that there are things, first of all, the definition for this is that there are things that would exist as they are independent of us and our perspective. That's a definition that we never actually got. This is what the mythos of objective reality is. This is what we characterize as truth because they sufficiently stand alone absent our own perspective. These truths come in two forms, ones we've caught and then ones we've chased. The ones we've caught form the baseline, right? Things we already know is probably objectively true or are objectively true, which is what everything else is built upon, which is what society is then built up upon, and how we get these advancements in society that save lives and mitigate suffering, right? The second one is the ones that we chase, right? This is a discovery element, things that we don't yet know for certain or things that we don't yet understand, but the belief that there is a reality in which these elements actually exist and are objectively true. This is what essentially propels society forward and inspires us to continually chase that truth, to innovate, to create, to inspire. This is why it's important from a principle perspective. Principally, it acts as the propeller that moves the pursuit of truth forward, onward, and upward, right? In a world in which we don't buy into this mythos, we rely on traditional paths, which is what they wanted to talk to you. This is what it looks like Huron-Darnos or Sang-Lomas practicing bloodletting techniques because this is the traditional pathway. No, objectively we know this is how you spread diseases and things like that, right? Sacrifice and mutilation of the peers because they don't treat the world through an appropriate scientific lens that is the objective reality. So this covers a lot of these scientific wins, and I could win on science alone, but I'm going to do more than that because there's more to this reality. So let's talk about ethical objectivity, right? Objective reality is more than just science, right? The purview of objectivity is far more broad, right? It includes things like morality. In this reality, there are objective ethics that exist too, right? That is that causing or prolonging unnecessary suffering is objectively a bad thing. Or that the unconsensual extermination of another human life is objectively a bad thing. These are elements of an objective reality that we think make the world a better place when we hold ourselves to these standards, right? This objective lens is through which we can view reality in regards to how we relate to each other, which is what ultimately the Prime Minister wanted, talking about how we relate to other humans. We do this through ethical objectivity, and we think this is the best metric to do so, other than this weird subjective thing, because under a subjective lens, what we get is that, you can see from empirics, you get more disenfranchisement, more unnecessary human rights abuse, unnecessary suffering, say the conscription of child soldiers, or the victims of harsher social penalties in certain cultures, right? This ethical objectivity or belief in ethical objectivity gives actors strong ground upon which to act and pursue that which is most good for society, which is ultimately what this round comes down to, is getting that most good. You get less suffering on our side of the house because we've got ground in which you can pursue these goods, i.e. something objectively ethical, and it also allows the allowance for subjectivity in any regard ultimately undermines this, because you have this weird subjective moral that seeks to undermine what is objectively good for the world. Before I continue, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, so look, morality is a subjective repulsion to an action, right? There are sociopaths who are not repulsed by letting animals suffer, by letting them bleed out. But what we think on our side of the house is that subjectively, when I see something bleed out, I am repulsed by it. That's where we get our morals from, not some objective...
Right, so objectively, the sociopath's morals are flawed then, right? And we as a society ought to seek to correct that. This is where you get that. But beyond that, right? This grounding that we get from ethical objectivity and scientific objectivity is important for us as humans, because it allows us to orient ourselves to the world around us in a way that is consistent. If we all consistently orient ourselves in the same way around this objective reality, we're more likely to safely form our identities without psychological harms. We're less likely to engage in conflict with one another because there are things that are objectively good and objectively bad. And we're more likely to pursue certain truths in society that benefit society writ large, right? Without objective reality, without the mythos, even if it is a myth, without this pursuit, you don't get any of those goods, and it's essentially a free-for-all. We say that you have to uphold these standards of ethical objectivity, of scientific objectivity, and of this grounding that you get from this orientation that is so important for us being humans. For all these reasons, we think that we have no reason to not default on the mythos of objective reality, and for all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose this motion.
Okay, so here's the fundamental problem with side opposition, right? They bring to you all of these benefits, fail to clash with us on the harms, and they fail to clash with us when we tell you that A, none of the progress that they can claim on their side, as Jared tells you, is uniform or universal, right? So the progress that has been claimed has not been claimed by everybody. It has only been claimed by certain sections of society. Specifically, it has been claimed because this mythos of objective reality has given certain people authority over others. Why? Because they claim to possess that objective reality, and they use it to oppress others in turn, right? This is the sort of thing that allows for A, the progress to not be universal. Second, it allows for further suffering. So in fact, this mythos isn't actually a tool for progress, it's a tool for oppression that is used overwhelmingly by dictators and people who have a vested interest in not letting it spread, right? I'm going to identify basically 3 points of clash throughout this whole debate, try to clear things up, tell you what they said, tell you why we're better, and basically, yeah, I'm going to clear everything up. The first point is whether the mythos of reality is good as a lens through which to view the world. OG spoke about how actualization is harmed by such a thing, and the benefits of not having it at all, because they said it's better progress for science and better progress for self-actualization and art. OO said look, it's not the objective reality itself that we strive towards, which is a conflict on their side, which that half disagrees with, but also it's the myth itself. That's what we agree on our side. Yeah, it's the myth itself that is inherently harmful, that allows other people to be oppressed by it. Because if you can convince people that there is such a thing as objective reality, then there is such a thing as absolute right and wrong. And the person who possesses claim and authority over what constitutes absolute right and wrong, as Jared tells you, is going to be the person who is in a position to oppress everybody else, right? Then, so what have we told you? Also, okay, so that's the clash that we have with OO. We say look, which side does it better? The pursuit of benefit would have done all of this progress anyway, which is because humans are inherently self-interested, they would have found a way to make things easier and better for themselves as time went along anyway. You don't need this objective reality of awesomeness that you need to strive for this, right? We'll have that on our side anyway. But also on their side, what happens when you've got one objective reality? Essentially, the person who possesses it cannot be argued with. And as Jared tells you, that's inherently harmful to the marketplace of ideas, because there's no opposition, there's no way to solve a problem, because you're not allowed to say that there is a problem, because in objectively, things are better. Objectively, utilitarianism says a certain course of action is better, and that outweighs any of the harms that you may try to bring out on your side.
Okay, but we've explained to you why this mythos is ultimately good for all people, but even without this, right, what foil/comparison exists for the people you're talking about to even recognize their own biased perspective?
No, what we're saying on our side is that when you don't allow for such dialogue, when you don't allow people to question things based on the idea that there is someone or some institution or like some person who knows the right thing to do, then you don't allow for like any recourse. When you don't have any recourse, you have no way for these people to move out of it. On their side, they don't have like a way to move out of any of the oppression that they're talking about, because you cannot question the person in charge, essentially. And that's what we've shown you on our side. So like that is what outweighs any of the progress that they bring, because any of the progress that they may claim to bring, A, I've shown you it doesn't exist. But B, even if you get such progress, it is outweighed by the suffering, because the progress that you bring doesn't even go to everybody, essentially, right? So that's on our side. They spoke about science and art, that's cool, but we still say it's outweighed by the suffering that Jared showed you. Second, the second point of clash is like progress, right? Does this mythos actually contribute to it? And we showed you, like, because it's used by people to justify oppression, to ignore points of view, whoever is closest to the objective truth at a certain point in time is the person who has authority over, like, everybody else, right? Why? Because absolute truth, again, means that there's absolute right, which gives people the incentive to punish deviation from whoever is in charge of the truth at the time, whoever possesses it at the time. Why is this bad? Because then deviation can be punished, right? And that person has the authority to do like anything they can. Jared tells you why this is inherently like harmful to like the marketplace of ideas, how you can't debate with it. Because like, look, how are you going to find a solution to a problem? They say like that's what essentially what you need to do, right? To progress, you need to find solutions to problems. But because you can't argue with the people in charge, you don't get to agree that there is a problem. And when you don't have that, there's nothing that you can go towards. There's no direction, as they say, that you can go towards. Now, that's the idea that they never clashed with. The progress, again, like I said, would have happened anyway back then.
Right, so I've already solved for this when I talk about how objective reality is a self-correcting system, and the pursuit of those objectivity things will eventually solve for these types of evils in the world.
No, actually he didn't. He spoke about like standards of objectivity, right? But this falls to our side also, because the people who tend to agree on what constitutes the standards of objectivity at a given point of time also tend to be the people, like I said, who hold the authority at the time, who claim to be closest to the like absolute truth, who claim to have like know better than everybody else, essentially. Jared showed you how like having this objective truth is harmful because it allows you to justify utilitarianism in the way like that shows that justifies what you see fit. Essentially, it allows you to leave aside entire populations of people from the progress, because it's like, hey, it's okay because it justifies because people are better off in the long run. If you've got enough people left out of the progress that you have for a long enough time, you can always justify it. Like colonialism, you could always have justified it by utilitarianism. Hey, in the long run, like everybody's happier. But no, people are suffering systematically and they have no way out. That's what we have on our side of the house. Jared has shown you, like, because they can convince you, because the mythos itself allows you to convince entire sections of people that you are the person who knows what's right, you are given a unique tool that cannot be argued with, that you can use to oppress them, right? Think about, like, economic policy. If you have like certain like objective truth or whatever, you can say, look, this is the economic policy that's completely right because this is like this is justified by the numbers, this is backed up by the numbers, and like entire people's lives change because of it. Jared tells you about like how without this tool you'll have to be accountable for your own bias. You can't just be like, oh well, there's objective reality and there's nothing I can do about it. This is just truth. But if you don't have that, then you have to be accountable for your own bias. You can argue with it. You can be held accountable for the decisions that you make, and essentially that's what we have in our side of the house that they don't have in theirs. He spoke about like standards of objectivity. I've already taken that down. He spoke about how it's the basis of society and it mitigates suffering. We've told you that it doesn't. He spoke about ethical objectivity, and it's the same thing. If you have an ethical objectivity, it's often by like a group of people or like a few people who are on the top who decide what constitutes like the best ethical course of action that you have. That's eventually, as we see, like certain truths that benefit society don't actually benefit everybody. What have I shown you like in totality, right? We've shown you that essentially our case ends up rebutting both like opening half and back half because it's the same principle. Whenever you have standards of objectivity, they say like, look, on the other hand, you're going to have like subjective systems that everybody's going to decide on. And we're telling you that that's what you have anyway. The only thing that this mythos does is it gives you the claim, it gives you legitimacy, and it gives you authority that you would not otherwise have, that you should not otherwise have. And therefore, I urge you to vote this side.
pursuit of objective reality or truth worthwhile? I think if we answer that question, we deal with the opening government and a little bit of the closing government. Then secondly, is orientation necessary via this objective reality? Those are my two questions. I'm going to get to them after we take care of housekeeping, which needs to be done. So we'll talk about first the harms that we apparently didn't clash with. Like, dude, yes we did, but we'll do it again. So first of all, limiting market ideas. Okay, look, market ideas are only limited when people stop questioning what the objective reality truly is. That pursuit of objective reality never ceases to exist though, so market ideas are never limited. The second harm they bring to you. The recognition of objective reality leads to a rejection of subjective reality. Like, I just don't think so, right? Like, I think I know how the universe was created, but I can still ponder other options for how the universe was created. So even if I accept an objective reality, I can still ponder other subjective realities like religion. The third harm. Solving social issues with one lens is pernicious, right? And I'm sorry, I reworded that, but it's the same thing. Number one, no one knows what the objectively best method is to solve issues like homelessness or other social issues, right? So what do we then do? Nothing? No, we do trial and error, right? That is what the pursuit of objective reality is. We trial one method, which we think could be the objectively best solution, and if it doesn't work, we try to pursue the next objective method, which is a potentially best solution. That is what objective reality brings you, that pursuit. Let's go on to the next harm. The benefits are not universally claimed. Well, look, I mean, the objective reality existing and being discovered is a benefit in and of itself, because even though not everyone in the world may be able to access it, at least it exists, at least some people that access it, and over time, those people that do access the objective reality, like gravity being 9.8 meters per second, will proliferate that knowledge onto the world. But then she goes on to say, well look, people can abuse objective reality by convincing others that there is absolute right and wrong, and this is where Tanner's sick nuance answers the entire problem they're bringing to you, right? Where objective reality is self-correcting via that pursuit. You can question the people in charge. If what she was saying was true, slaves would never value themselves, right? Like, they would never free their minds. If some people never do that, it's okay. We'll take them at their best, right? Even if some people never question the authority, others will take the red pill and free us all. Now, is the pursuit of truth worthwhile, right? So the Prime Minister thinks that objective reality is the only thing that is valuable, right? Like, the pursuit is harmful because we never truly get there. But the pursuit is obviously valuable. To say that it's not is like debate land bullshit. Tanner talked about how that continual chase creates innovation, inspiration, pragmatically all the products of modern science come from this pursuit of objective reality. We save lives. Weigh that against your art, dude. Okay, but even if we didn't buy into this objective reality, we wouldn't believe in, what we hear out of the Deputy Prime Minister. And I think we'd probably care less about nations developing and polluting if we didn't accept that climate change was an objective reality. Moving on. If we didn't also, Tanner brought you some unique harms. Bloodletting and leech therapy would probably be in DaVita dialysis centers. And that's not a good thing. But beyond these tangibles, we also tell you that it's not just a pursuit. We can all actually achieve this objective reality, right? Tanner uniquely talks to you about ethical objectivity, which I don't think was responded to, but I was dozing off. So, objective objectivity absolutely does exist, right? Like, causing unnecessary suffering is wrong. That is objective reality. Let's not disagree with that. Objective reality is that we are all created equally. This solid objective ground allows us for the pursuit of morality. Okay, so who are we? Orientation is particularly critical here, and this is the second point that Tanner brings to you. We need the pursuit of objective reality to be able to orient ourselves and form our identity to the world around us. This is the question, right? Who do you think you are, bro? Who do you really think you are? I'm not just talking about your name, I'm not just talking about your hobbies, or even your skin color, right? But rather what you think of yourself. How you measure your worth as a human being, whether or not you think you're a good person. These questions and many others about yourself can only be answered by you establishing a baseline that Tanner talks to you about, by you grounding yourself in order to learn more about yourself and discover the world around you. Objective reality, or the pursuit of it, absolutely gives us that right and composure. Okay, so you can never truly know who you are without the objective truth, right? You can never lie in your deathbed and wonder if your life was worthwhile without being able to ground yourself in some sort of greater meaning. That greater meaning solely comes to the pursuit of objective reality. That is what makes us human. This debate's over.
Yeah.
Okay, so Tom's asked us to go through like a full-on ranking of the rounds, so we gave the fourth through the first. Let me see, unfortunately, not so unfortunately because you didn't make the final, but unfortunately in the final we ended up giving the fourth to the opening government, we give the third to the closing government, we give the second to the opening opposition, and so the day's champions, like 1/3 of the California Cup champions so far would be closing opposition. Okay, so. In terms of the reasoning, I think that like different teams, just overall different teams did a better or worse job of managing to structure their speeches. I mean, obviously this like, reality thing, as was pointed out, could apply to like an infinite number of things, and there's just the lack of structure made it really hard for some teams to kind of ground and give direction to their speeches. I think largely that was more of a criticism of the government side than the opposition side. So we get a lot of different points, but none of them are really gone into, especially in the opening government. Some of them are okay. They seem like you're going in a good direction. Some of them are kind of awkward directions, some, including like the art point, which is something you spend a lot of time on. I think that there's a lot more, there's a lot better arguments that you guys bring up that you could have allocated time to and prioritized. I mean, especially in the second speech, we get some things, you know, talking about how the journey and the deviation from the journey, like identifies people as moving backwards or moving other, and then the ramifications of that. That would be a type of structure like that we got out of some of the other teams that I think you guys could have built from, but there wasn't enough of that. It was kind of thrown out as a point, as rather than a a framework for which you guys could build your speeches. So I think that was a little bit problematic. Some of the stuff on Buddhism and how other religions view the world, maybe that could be another framework you could use. Like we want people viewing the world through these lenses, and that could be a precedent that you could go for. But again, it was just sort of a point. And again, the things that you guys made most of the points off of was art, except the art point and the science point. The other problem with the art and the science point is that I think that you need to prove that these things are mutually exclusive. With like these, the way viewing the world in this way is going to be mutually exclusive with also viewing the world in other ways. And you got asked a few times by opposition, like why can't they also examine the subjectivity of human nature, etc., while still pursuing an objective reality? We didn't really get an answer for that. So with since you guys are kind of harping your case on this idea that objective reality, the pursuit of objective reality, pushes out any other pursuits, and that's harmful. You need to prove to us that thesis, which is that it actually does push out, rather than it's something that can exist, coexist alongside. So I think that was problematic. Another thing that I thought was problematic was it was too kind of asserted the idea, like what the definition of a human is and how it moves us away from what a human should be. So if you're going to run that it's problematic because it runs us away from a human should be, you need to just tell us exactly what is important about humanity. Define humanity for us. We didn't get any definition, so when we get like a kind of short definition from closing opposition, but pretty legitimate, saying like we think that getting rid of diseases is actually furthering humanity and what it means to be human, rather than moving away from it. That's enough, at least when nobody else brought up another definition in the round, it's enough for us to go, cool, that's the definition that we can go with. So that would be the issues we've got with the opening government. Closing government, a little bit more structure. We have the idea of the oppression, so it's like trickle-down economics of objectivity. In your case, in saying that it doesn't reach the bottom, it's kind of consolidated in the at the top. The trickle-down argumentation, you guys didn't call it that, but the trickle-down rebuttal came from the opposition side, saying like, hey, even if it starts off consolidated at the top, it still works its way down to the benefits. And then also this idea, like your idea of like a monarch basically presupposes that there's going to be one person with one objective reality, I guess in their little society. When, as they pointed out, there's actually a lot of societies and a lot of like organizational structures operating at the same time. So like this monarch could check back against that monarch, or the people underneath that monarch could check back against it. So again, there's some presuppositions that we get from you guys that your case is built on that aren't necessarily proven, similar to the opening government. So without proving those things, it's hard for you guys to take in the top half, along with the problems I mentioned of just kind of the lack of structure that Gov side as a whole, sort of, and then the mutual exclusivity stuff also kind of applies to you guys largely. So you guys didn't have those problems. That's why you guys are in the top half of the debate. So the difference between the second and the first, again, largely structural. I do think, again, that the ethical stuff that we get coming out of closing opposition, they managed to engage in the science debate as well as you guys engaged in the science debate, with an interesting caveat through the rebuttal of defining what it means to be human. So like as we progress as humans through like science and medicine, things like that, like the idea of progress requires us to identify like what it means to be human. Right? And so you guys don't have that definition. So I think that's roughly comparable, but then they add in a lot of other sections to the debate, along with the framework of saying that this is a building block that we can use to base our society on, and then in all of these areas of society, based on that building block that we all kind of agree, we can grow from there. So I think that was just a little bit clear out of the closing opposition. Some of the rebuttals to things that had happened before you, we thought were clear coming out of closing opposition too. So it's chances that you guys kind of had to respond, and we got the arguments were kind of left on the table, and they finally cleared it up. And then adding in the idea of ethics, what I thought was good, wasn't responded to by closing government either. The whole ethical objectivity argument, that was good. I think, and a little bit of interaction between the idea of not just this as a theory that we can pursue, but also as a thing that might exist. There was a little bit more discussion of both of those aspects of objective reality. Not just the mythos, but maybe the reality of it has benefits also. So I think just a more complete case coming from the closing opposition, again, probably facilitated by the fact that they have more of a framework to their speeches that allows for them to cover more material in a structured way, so they get more on the ground. Last comment, I think something like just generally for the round, something that might have been interesting maybe from opening government is to kind of place the round as a thought experiment. Like what happened was kind of like, here's objective reality, and then here's like parts of society that it could implement with. It's really hard for teams, especially in prep time. Like the odds of you or 15 minutes focusing on the same things as theirs is like 0, right? Or I mean, maybe it's not 0, that would be objective, but so it's very unlikely. So you get a really messy debate. I think something that might be interesting is to come up with a thought experiment, saying like, if society had determined there was not an objective reality at this point in advancement, what would the world look like? That would be better or worse. Because that is, you guys are saying like, here's a scientist, here's how it would benefit or hurt a scientist, here's a politician, here's a migrant worker that has no access to it, et cetera, et cetera. It's really hard to compare those things. So that sort of thing from opening government, I mean, would help you guys take like such a huge topic, and I think fairly ground it down in a way, or like shrink it in a way that's both manageable for you, but also fair to the other teams in the round, where they don't like, it's not abusive on your part. So I think something along those lines, some sort of thought experiment, or taking a more particular case, like we're going to look at it in this group of people, or in this particular, just specified in some way. I think it might have been interesting. I mean, I could talk to you more about what some other ideas were, but I think for me the coolest one would probably be like at this point in our development, like right before we invented the wheel, I don't know, some shit right there. Then objective reality wasn't a thing. How would we have developed, and what would the world look like? And it would be a better world than the fact that we did decide that this is a thing. So that might be just something interesting for all the teams around. It's just something to think about. Cool.
Thank you for judging.